I was looking at some pictures this week of myself, not because I need to look at myself. I was looking at myself because I was surprised how much I've changed. Let's take a look. This is me dedicating Carol Ann in Westfield, New York. And this is me preaching at a church in Farrell, Pennsylvania, which I pastored. I don't look like that. I look at a picture like that and say, who's that? Who is that? And then I saw this. This is Nancy and I at the Jolly Roger. And just look at those sideburns. And this is me at Sunlight, I think in the 80s or something, welcoming everybody, welcoming you to service. And I don't even recognize that person. Life does something. Time does something to our looks. We start to change. I read somewhere where I think it was Lucille Ball said, you know, what you need to do is, if you want to stay young, is you got to eat properly, you got to stay happy, and lie about your age. That's what you need to do. If you're going to change, and change will come, just live long enough. Because we keep transitioning. We are one thing and we transition to another thing, and we look different when we transfer ourselves to another place. When a child is born, or before the child is born, they're automatically fed and protected. The temperature is absolutely controlled, but they can't stay there, because in 9 months they outgrow their place and they need to transition out. So birth is victory. When a child is born, it's painful for the mom and it's also painful for the child, but it represents a great victory. And the child is now eating formula, pablum, and Gerber's. But they can't live on that forever. They have to transition from that stage to the next stage, and eventually they end up in school, and that's another important step, but you can't stay there. Well, some do, but you're not supposed to stay there. You end up hopefully graduating, and that is another form of victory. So life is a time of transitions from one stage to another stage, and each one represents a victory that we are involved in. Paul said this, he said, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. What's important in this verse for me is that it's not automatic. That when you become a man, you have to put away this things you have to put away. You just don't automatically grow up. You put away, you learn a few things and you learn to put away some of those childish things. For instance, I don't play marbles anymore because there's nothing wrong with marbles. It's just that I grew out of that. And now I got marbles in my head. But we grow out of things, and we have to learn how to become men and women. It's not automatic. Now that brings me to the text in the 5th chapter of Joshua. The children of Israel have been in the wilderness for 40 years. Whenever they were thirsty, God provided water from a rock. When they were hungry, God sent manna from heaven. Somebody figured out that it must have been about 6 million pounds of manna every day. And on Friday, it would be 12 million pounds of manna because they didn't go out on the Sabbath. And so God took care, provided for them. He had a pillar of cloud, pillar of fire to lead them. And so they tangibly had the presence of God there to help them. But then they get to the promised land. And this is what it says in the 12th chapter, the 12th verse of the 5th chapter of Joshua. Then the manna ceased. After 40 years. God was doing something for 40 years and he stopped doing it. On the day after they had eaten the produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land. When the provision of God stops, it doesn't mean God's angry or upset with us. It just means that we're ready to transition to another stage in life. For 40 years, God was providing the manna for the children of Israel. But when they entered into the promised land, it was almost like graduation. Now they had to do something about providing for themselves. They now had to plant the seed. They had to harvest the crop. They had to bake the bread. It was no longer being sent down in the form of manna. Now there was something for them to do. They had to do it themselves. Now that reminds me of a little eaglet. Eaglet is in a very comfortable nest. It's got all of this fur and soft feathers. And the mother feeds the little eaglet every day. She brings food to the eaglet, protects the eaglet, and the eaglet grows. But the time is coming when the eaglet has got to get out of that nest. And when the eagle gets out of the nest, it's one of the scariest things the eaglet will ever discover, that those wings behind its back is supposed to help him actually fly. And the eagle has never done that before. And so when the mother eagle asks the little eaglet to leave the nest, he doesn't want to. Long story short, she pushes him out, lovingly pushes him out. And he learns how to fly because this is the next stage in his life. He needs to learn how to provide for himself. No longer is mom going to be bringing little morsels of food for the eaglet. Now the eagle needs to fly and get its own food. God has stages like that for us. He provides us with certain things in order to help us grow when we were born again. God provides us, he carries us, he nurtures us, and he feeds us. But then there comes a time when the provision of God stops and God is expecting us to take care of ourselves. That kind of be a scary time because that's forcing us to grow up. And growing up is not exactly what we would like to do, and it's not automatic either. There's some people at 60, 70 years old that still haven't grown up yet. And there are things that we got to deal with. We got to deal with some things like frustration. You're not grown up until you know how to deal with a frustration. You have to deal with anger. You have to deal with delay. There are delays all over. Everywhere you go, there's some delay. There's some frustration. There's some reason to get you up. If I ask for a show of hands, I think all our hands would go up. Yeah, Pastor Joe, I've been frustrated and I've been angry and I don't like delays. And I was thinking that Paul, who was anointed by God to establish churches all over Asia Minor, was thrown in jail. That's a delay. And while he was in jail, he had to figure out what he's going to do. So he started thinking. He started writing. You know, the sign of growing up is when you learn how to do something with the stuff that comes to you that you don't like. When you learn how to deal with things that come against you or that are inconveniences. I read about a mother who went to a psychologist. She said, "No, doctor, my son is doing something, needs some help." He said, "What?" She said, "Well, he makes mud pies, and then he wants to eat them." And the psychologist said, "My dear lady, it's perfectly normal for a child to make mud pies and want to eat them." She said, "Well, I disagree with you, and so does my son's wife, my son's wife." Because it's a time for us to I get it right. I'll get this right. There's a time for us to grow up. There's a time for us to get out of the sandbox. There's time for us to do things differently than we used to do before. It's okay to throw a temper tantrum if you're 2 years old, but it's not okay when you're 17 years old to throw a temper tantrum. We need to learn how to grow up. It's important to grow up. Growing up, every time we grow into another stage, that is a victory. When we learn how to deal with frustration, it's a victory. When we learn how to deal with anger, learn how to deal with delays. These are victories. These are the signs that we are growing up. I read about a man who was trying to get his lawnmower started, and he couldn't. He actually went into the home, got a shotgun, went outside, and shot the lawnmower. Let's see if that works now. All it needed was gas. Sometimes the mark of growing up is just simply learning to think, learning to roll with the punch, learning to figure things out because things happen and we have to figure out how to deal with stuff that happens. This is the place where many people fail. We fail here because something suddenly comes at us and we don't know how to handle it. And that's when God is nudging us out of the nest to learn how to fly. Growing up is a difficult job. Dealing with criticism. Have you ever been criticized? It's like a shock wave to your system. Criticism and misunderstanding. These are the things that happen to everybody in some form, in some way. Lies. People lie. I saw the pastor talking to the pianist. There must be something in that. They don't say he was married to the pianist. People say things. Have you ever been insulted? If you haven't, you will be. It's just a matter of time. People will say things to hurt you. They'll say things. I remember when I was going from one school to another school, you won't get A's in this school. I took that as an insult. It ended up motivating me to make sure I got an A in her class. And these things will happen. And there's gossip, there's stuff. These are the things that require us to step out of where we were when we were children and to step into the area, the next stage where we are adults that learn how to handle the stuff that comes our way. Things will happen. And what happens if we don't learn, if we don't grow up? We become bitter. We become resentful. We become real sensitive, or real defensive. I remember the Beatles sang a song, let it be, let it be, let it be, let it be. This would be a great song for Dustin to do. Hear the words of wisdom, let it be. Some things we need to grow up to learn how to let it be. Let it go. That brings me to Joshua. Joshua is at the walls of Jericho. And this is a strange thing. The fact, well, you'll see in a moment. Joshua is now at the walls of Jericho, and this is a place where he is going to grow up. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, what would he be doing at Jericho in the first place? What he was doing, he was wondering how he was going to get over those walls. I want you to know that this 5th chapter, God did not tell him how he was going to get through those walls. So he's on his own. He's looking at the walls, and we've done that. We've looked at obstacles. We don't know how we're going to get through the obstacle. He's looking at this obstacle, and he's trying to figure out how am I going to do this thing? And he's starting to calculate. I got so many men. This is what the men can do, and this is my strategy. Maybe I'll use this as a strategy. And he's figuring. You got to keep on figuring. How are we going to accomplish what it is that God called us to do? It's one of the problems that we have is we start figuring how we're going to do something. God has not told us how it's going to be done, but we're trying to get ahead of God. Maybe it's like second guessing. This is how I'm supposed to get this thing done, and so we start figuring. And Joshua's trying to figure out how he's going to get. You know what you're going to figure out? When you get to a situation like this, and we all do, when we get to the place where we're facing the walls and we don't know how we're going to manage through those walls, the discovery that we make is an incredible victory. It's this discovery. I am weak, but thou art strong. We never think of that as a victory, but that is a victory. It's a victory to discover, to realize that we don't have what it takes to accomplish what it is God called us to do. That God gave us a mountain we can't climb. He put an obstacle out there we have no idea how to overcome. And you may be in that place right now. You're facing something. You don't know how you're going to get around this thing. How are you going to step over this thing? It's too big. It's too wide. It's too deep. And Joshua is figuring out, and he comes to the place where he realizes there's no strategy he could use to take down those walls. He has no idea how those walls are coming down. And we face those same kind of situations in our lives. I have no idea, Lord, how I'm going to get through this thing. And like that song goes, Lord, you gave me a mountain I don't think I can climb. And while Joshua is thinking that, I'm thinking about how Joshua is thinking through this. And I remember before I went to Bible school, the pastor's wife asked me a question. And she said, what are you going to be when you graduate from Bible school? I wasn't expecting the question, and I gave an answer. I told her I was going to be an evangelist. She looked at me, she smiled, and then she laughed. She knew something about me I didn't even know about myself. What do I know? When I was a kid, I was going to be a cowboy. I was going to go after the bad guys. Now I go after the demons. When I was a kid, I wanted to have a farm. And no, not the farm. I was living in a city, inner city kid. I wanted a farm so I could have dogs. That was the reason. Now I have dogs. The point is, we don't really always understand what we ought to be and how we're going to be it. So when I went to Bible school, I remember in Bible school we would go down to the prayer room. It was in the basement area, and it was a small area, and the students would gather in this prayer room, and then some student would start off by singing a song while we were praying. Where he leads me, I will follow. Sing that with me just for a moment. Where he leads me, I will follow. Where he leads me, I will follow. Where he leads me, I will follow. I'll go with him all the way. I don't know how many times I sang that song and I thought about the words where he leads me. I was thinking God was going to lead me in a certain way, and I figured that I went to Bible school, I'm learning to preach, and I'm learning to do ministry, and so that must be where God is going to lead me. I had no idea he was leading me as a church custodian to clean a church. I didn't know that. I didn't figure that in. I didn't figure God was leading me to be a youth pastor for several years, and I didn't figure God was leading me to come to California. That was the last thing that I'd have in my mind, coming to California to start a church. No way was I figuring that. And I never figured that God would lead me to a place where I would be involved in real estate. It's just, so I reflect back on the song that I sang and still sing. Where he leads me, I will follow. We don't know God's ways. So we learn how to follow. Because when we learn how to follow him, we're growing up. When we get to the place where we realize, I am weak, but thou art strong, that's a great victory. Because we are realizing that we are not capable of handling the stuff that comes our way. And that we need God's help. And that God leads in ways that are very difficult for us to understand. You know, I remember years ago, before I was born, there was a famous preacher, who preached the message entitled, "A Funny Thing Happened to Me on My Way to Heaven." And then he talked about all of the strange things he never planned on that God led him. If we were to sit down and talk and you would tell me about what your ideal was at one time, and then you talk to me about what is real, what really happened, and you would discover that you did things you were never expecting. You were led in places you never thought you would go. So we learn how to rely on God, and that's a sign of growing up, learning to rely on him. I don't know everything. I don't understand everything, so I got to get into your word. Your word's got to get into me, because I can't figure this thing out myself. Joshua's at the walls. He can't figure out how he's going to get over those walls. So we learn how to trust him. While Joshua was at the wall, he saw a man who stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. That's a little threatening. So Joshua sees this man who happens to be probably the Lord in angelic form. But whoever this man was, he tells him, well, let's get into the story. He says, are you for us or are you for our adversaries, Joshua said. And the answer was, no, as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. I didn't come to take sides. I came to take over. That's the Lord's mission, to take over. And he comes to, Joshua is the leader. God called him. As I was Moses, I will be with you. If I were Joshua and God said that to me, this is what I would have thought. As I was with Moses, so shall I be with you. Well, let me see how you were with Moses. The people wanted to stone him every other week. They rejected him. No, thank you. I think you need to do a new thing with me. But this is the way God operates. As I was with Moses, I will be with you. And the commander of the Lord's army says, I've come here to take over this thing. You can't get through those walls by yourself. You have already spent a little time thinking how you're going to do it. You can't do it. And that's why the Lord sent this commander, or the Lord himself is the commander, and he comes to tell Joshua he's got everything under control. One of the things that we need to discover when we grow up in God is that he's in charge. Joshua's not in charge. The Lord's in charge. In fact, it doesn't even matter what your title is. It doesn't matter what my title is. He is the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning, the end, the first and the last. It's his title, not my title. It doesn't matter what kind of seniority I have. I've had a lot of seniority here. It doesn't matter what my seniority is. He's the Rock of Ages. He's been around a long time. So what we do is we discover who the Lord is. We discover that he's the one that's in control. And it's not my name. My name, what does my name mean? His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. That's the name that and at his name every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is the Lord. So when we get to the place where we could say, I need thee, oh, I need thee, we're growing up. Isn't it interesting? Because children think that when they grow up, they'll be independent. But the truth of the matter is, when we grow up, we're going to discover how dependent we are. I need thee. Oh, I need thee. Because I can't figure out how to get over those walls. I need thee. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshiped. Reason why I think that commander was Jesus, because angels don't receive worship. But this person received worship. Submission. That's a sign of victory. When a person is willing to bow, coming to Jesus is probably the most important thing you will ever do. Come into Jesus, because everything starts right there. And Joshua bows down and falls at his feet, and he starts to worship the Lord. And he says, "What do you want?" And the angel says, the Lord says, take off your sandal, for the place you stand on is holy. I would have never thought that standing at the walls of Jericho, an enemy city, would be considered holy. And that got me to thinking. The places where God wants us to stand are difficult places. He fell down and worshiped the Lord. And then the Lord said, take off your sandal because the ground you're standing on is holy. I guess the question is, where are you standing? Because wherever you are standing, God considers that holy. When I'm here, this is holy. When you're in school, that's holy. When you're at home, that's holy ground. Your business, holy. Every place we go, every place you put your foot, the Lord said, every place you put your foot shall be a possession is unto you. It's a possession is unto you. It's holy ground. You're standing on holy ground. But the wall is an obstacle. I don't understand. Yeah, that's right. Where you stand is holy ground. That wall, that city, which was cursed by God, is holy right now. So the question would be to you, is where are you standing? Because God wants to make that place holy. This is the victory. The victory is where you stand. It's not somewhere else. It's right here. It's right where you're at. With what in whatever stage you happen to be in. That's holy ground. And God wants to make victory to come out of where you are. So we're going to sing this chorus again. And as we sing it, I want you to think about how God leads. And God sometimes leads in places we would not expect. In fact, we need to make room in our lives for the unexpected, because God leads us in unexpected places. But wherever he leads us, there'll be victory. And the place you stand on is holy.
Will follow where he leads me. I will follow.
This altar is open. I'd be glad to pray with you.